a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. People like you. There's a place up there for people like you. I know you're out there, so keep doing what you do. 'Cause there's a place up there for people like you. If you give a little more than you take, and if you try to fix more than you break, if you're the kind who takes the time to help a stranger in the rain, there's a place for people like you. If you stand up for those down on their knees and lend a voice to those who cannot speak, if you shine a little light, give sight to the ones who've lost their way, there's a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place. Trying to be the change you wanna see. If you lay down your life for love so someone could be saved, there's a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. There's a place up there for people like you. I know you're out there, so keep doing what you do. 'Cause there's a place up there for people like you. If you give a little more than you take, and if you try to fix more than you break, if you're the kind who takes the time to help a stranger in the rain, there's a place for people like you. If you stand up for those down on their knees and lend a voice to those who cannot speak, if you shine a little light, give sight to the ones who've lost their way, there's a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. If you walk around with your heart on your sleeve, and if you're trying to be the change you want to see, if you lay down your life for love so someone could be saved, there's a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. There's a place up there for people like you. I know you're out there, so keep doing what you do. 'Cause there's a place up there for people like you. If you give a little more than you take, and if you try to fix more than you break. If you're the kind who takes the time to help a stranger in the rain, there's a place for people like you. If you stand up for those down on their knees and lend a voice to those who cannot speak, if you shout.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. The session will be beginning in approximately 2 minutes. The session will be beginning in approximately 2 minutes. Thank you for your patience.
Streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. If you walk around with your heart on your sleeve, trying to be the change you want to see, if you lay down your life for love so someone could be saved, there's a place for people like you. I've heard up there the streets are made of gold, and when you get there, there's a hand to hold. I believe when your days down here are through, there's a place up there for people like you. There's a place up there for people like you. I know you're out there, so keep doing what you do, 'cause there's a place up there for people like you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Aga Khan University's Human Resource Department's inaugural webinar series on working with COVID-19. These webinars will explore the dimensions of learning and dialogues of the new norm that is COVID-19. To orient us today is the Director of Human Resources Academic, Terry Ramadan.
Thank you. I wish to welcome all of us who are joining us from various places, at home, in the office, in traffic, wherever you are. We're really delighted that you could make time to be here. I'd like to also welcome our panelists and our speakers and colleagues who are making this possible today. Now, one of our values as Aga Khan University is care, compassion, and respect. For those of you who are not familiar with them, we actually have 5 values, and that's one of them. And it is said that the quality of an organization is most often determined by the quality of questions asked. And we asked several questions in HR, and one that we found had many low-hanging fruits was the question of employee engagement. So today marks, as Itonga has said, the engagement journey that we hope will continue in years to come. And this journey will culminate in a platform that will find a home in the University Center as a regular, ongoing conversation platform where we converge regularly to share and interact with each other over a variety of subjects as Aga Khan University and hospital community. We sure hope to bring each and every one of you along this journey that is filled with the promise of discovery and fun, and we hope you will accept our invitation. In this inaugural three-part series, we'll tackle three key areas. First, off the press, today's destigmatization of COVID-19 and mental health wellness. Tomorrow, we will engage our experts on what we need to know about home-based care. And on Thursday, we will dwell into the space of communications in the times of COVID. All very interesting and relevant topics, especially given that the holiday season is here with us. We want to be fully armed and prepared so that should we need it, and touch wood that we don't, if we need the information, we will know what to do. And next year, we will roll out the other part series, so stay tuned for that. So 2020 has been awash with misinformation, disinformation, overabundance of information. Very distressing. But you know what? I'm sure, as many of you are, that every cloud has a silver lining. And one of the gifts that COVID has given us is the opportunity to talk about subjects that we don't talk about too often. So maybe our past holds us back. Maybe the language, we don't have it. Maybe we don't recognize the distress that we are facing because there is no blood and gore. Maybe we are afraid of the stigma. Maybe we are paralyzed by the fear. Even the most bold gets paralyzed. So today, I want us to spend some time with our colleagues here who are experts in areas that are very much in this space. I invite you on a journey of courage, a journey of boldness, a journey of exploration, a journey of clutching onto hope. Because if we must lose all else, the last thing we should lose is hope. So this afternoon, we'll engage in a very robust discussion in search of answers, to our most pressing questions, maybe questions that are in your mind now, maybe have been in your mind in the past, maybe in somebody's mind, and we will hear them today. And invite us all to remember that we can and shall overcome, and invite us all to drink from the well, from the fountain of hope together. So to introduce our speakers, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. You're all very familiar with him, Professor Lukoya Twoli, who is our Dean of the Medical College, and our distinguished panel that has our Regional Vice Provost, Alex Awiti, and our Director for Institute for Human Development, Professor Amina Abubakar. I hope we've been able to put faces to the names that I have mentioned. And I would also like to highlight for colleagues who are joining us that the questions that you wish to hear answered, kindly direct them to nairobi.communicationsea@aku.edu. Don't leave the session with that question on your mind. That answer to your question may be the solution that somebody else listening doesn't even know they need. So please send in the questions. Without further ado, it is my honor to welcome Lukoya, Professor Lukoya Twoli. Kindly, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Terry, for the wonderful introduction and for this great initiative. Yeah, just trying to set this up. Right. So thank you very much for this interesting series, and I think it's time. As you correctly pointed out, COVID-19, while it has come with a lot of challenges across the world, it has also brought certain opportunities that we might not have explored if it didn't happen. Due to the difficulties imposed upon us by COVID-19, we have to innovate, and we have to use different ways of reaching out to each other and communicating with each other. And that has meant that some people who might not have met this year, they have been able to meet digitally. And so I take that as one of the positive outcomes out of all this gloom and doom around COVID-19. I have previously spoken about stigma. I have previously spoken about COVID-19, and I constantly speak about mental health. So today I will try and bring it all together in one presentation that gives us an opportunity to discuss COVID-19 and mental health, as well as the stigma that is directed towards these areas of our lives. And so those are the three things that I'm going to address today. I'll begin by taking us on a tour of what stigma is and how stigma, especially in relation to COVID-19, affects our efforts to deal with COVID-19, to control COVID-19, and perhaps to think about very brief ways in which we can begin to attack that stigma in order to make our lives that much easier in these times. Then secondly, I will look at the impact of COVID-19 on our mental health, and then look at what are some of the strategies that are available to us for coping when confronted with the challenges we are facing today. And so, as usual, we begin with a question of what is stigma. And as those of you who have read on this subject will know, it is discrimination. Discrimination is a manifestation of stigma, and it is directed at an identifiable group of people, a place, a nation, whatever it is, and is defined by three key components. The first component of stigma, which produces stigma involuntarily, if you like, is ignorance. You know, people not knowing much about a subject like COVID-19 or even mental health. And because you do not know much about it, you often make up stories or fill in the gaps. This is just how our human brains are wired, that when there's a gap in our knowledge, when there's a gap in our visual field, when there's a gap in our hearing, the brain fills up those spaces in a way that makes sense to you as an individual. And often in technical subjects such as COVID-19 or mental health, the gaps, whatever we put in those gaps, is often inaccurate and often leads to negative outcomes. The second component of stigma is prejudice. As a result of your lack of knowledge, you fill in the gaps and develop certain attitudes based on the gaps that you have filled in. And therefore, this results in these negative attitudes and ideas, in this case about COVID-19, when we were dealing with mental health against people with mental ill health or people who serve that particular subsection of the population. And so you carry around these views and ideas about people whom you have placed outside of your group. And this comes in the form of prejudice. And the manifestation of all this then is discrimination when you engage in acts that segregate or separate you from those with COVID-19 or with the stigmatized attribute. It can be towards anything. In fact, it's been directed at people with HIV/AIDS, people with the mental illness, people with all sorts of conditions. I think if you read history, you will find stigma against people with leprosy because leprosy was so clear. You could see a person with leprosy, and there was a lot of stigma towards that as well as towards many other things. Stigma thrives in a certain cycle, and the cycle depends on us making certain decisions, whether consciously or unconsciously. So it may begin with a stereotype. You stereotype people who have mental illness as a certain kind of person. And usually the stereotype designates that person or group of people as definitely less than human, because anybody whom you as a group consider to be human becomes a part of your in-group. But when they are a bit different and slightly less than human, then certain stereotypes form around how we describe them. And this therefore divides us. There's a division between us and them. So them are the people who have an undesirable attribute, people about whom we have interesting attitudes towards. And this confers upon them, the them group, are conferred with a status that is lower than ours, so lower social status. They're different from us. They're not deserving of the same things that we are deserving of. And then this results in discrimination. And as you discriminate openly against groups of people, then they become labeled as that group of people who must be treated in a certain way. Like the man said, you give a dog a bad name and then you hang him. So we have labeled the group. They are undesirable. They're not people you're going to hang out with. They're not people you're going to listen to. They're not people whose points of view are important. And this then serves to strengthen the stereotype. And often over time, while it starts externally, it is internalized by some of the people who are stigmatized when they accept this stereotype, when they accept the social status that has been they have been placed into, and they accept the discriminatory behaviors that they're experiencing, and it becomes internalized stigma or self-stigma. And so there is a curve, and people have studied this, people who know better than I do have studied this, looking at the degree of tolerance vis-a-vis the degree of difference. And up to a certain point, when the percentage of those who are different is very small, like in this case on the curve here is about 1%, then people are able to tolerate you. You know, they can live with you if you're a few people who are different. They will call that diversity and they will live with you. But as the percentage of the people who are different within a group increases to appreciable levels, towards 10%, for instance, then you start, people start developing these attitudes. Who are these people? What is this group? And that starts creating certain stereotypes about that group over time. But if the population of those people who are different keeps increasing past 10% towards 20%, as the numbers increase significantly, then it becomes practically impossible to group them as other. And we have to find a way of living together, and they become part of the in-group. They're no longer them, and they're no longer subjects of stigma. So this is a curve that you might have noticed even in this country as COVID started, in March. There were a few people with COVID-19 that people knew, and the commonest question on these streets was, who do you know who has contracted COVID-19? Who do you know who has died of COVID-19? And as long as a majority of the people would say, I don't know anyone, then initially it wasn't a big deal. But then as people started knowing, but then they remained a small proportion of the population, stigmatizing attitudes developed. But as the numbers have increased, in my view, as each and every one of us has been touched by COVID-19, we are seeing probably a change with the people, even those who had the most stigmatizing attitudes in the beginning, starting to shift the language and say, anybody can get COVID-19, anybody can be affected. It appears to be pretty random who is getting severely affected and so on. So it starts tempering that language and becomes easier for us to accept that COVID-19 is with us, and we have to find ways of dealing with it among us. And the stigma towards people who get COVID-19 is driven by the same factors that I indicated. It's a new disease. We knew very little about it in the beginning. We are learning a lot more about it, but we still do not know enough about it to be comfortable that we can handle it. So that keeps the stigma going. We fear risky, new things that are risky, things that can kill us. They cause fear. And fear is one of the biggest drivers of stigma, because you have to other people so that you protect yourself from them. It feels safer if you can link this fear to something or someone tangible outside of our immediate circle, because then we have this illusion that we can protect ourselves from these people, even if the phenomenon exists out there. So people with COVID-19 in this case are easy targets. And this goes as well, to people with mental illness who are disenfranchised. They're easy targets because they will not stand up to you, especially once you have formed yourselves into a gang that shares certain attitudes towards them. And so why is it dangerous for us to allow this situation to continue within organizations, within communities and in countries? Because as long as people remain ignorant to the truth about a condition, they will not seek to be tested so that they can figure out whether they have this problem or not, because they don't want to be identified with it. In the case of COVID-19, you don't want anybody to say you have COVID-19 or indeed that you have even recovered from COVID-19 because of the expected attitudes and expected behaviors that come with that status. And if you have symptoms, you'll see people hiding those symptoms. I'm told it is criminal to cough in public nowadays, because the first thing everybody will shout when you clear your throat is COVID. And so people will hide those symptoms. You will have a fever, but you will, keep going because you don't want to be labeled as having COVID. And if you're infected and you're sick, you will not seek care. Because when you go to get care, you'll be diagnosed, you'll be labeled, and you'll be in that other group. Stigma inhibits protective behaviors, healthy behaviors, because if you do those things, if you go to some places in this country, even in this day wearing a mask, people tend to stay away from you and they assume you are the person with COVID, and that's why you're wearing the mask. So overall, it undermines social cohesion and solidarity. It leads to increased risk of spread of the virus, and is therefore something that is worth spending some time on. It's my opinion that if you handle the triad that I indicated in the beginning, ignorance, prejudice, and discrimination, you would be able to make a significant dent on stigma. So ignorance is often attacked by giving accurate, timely information, correcting misinformation that might be out there, answering questions to the satisfaction of those that are asking them, and being honest enough to admit what is known and what is not known. Prejudice, these are stigmatizing attitudes. You would have to model the desired behavior, and therefore the responsibility on the leadership of institutions and the leadership of organizations to model the behavior that is desired. And the behavior that is desired is a caring, humane, understanding, helping, and supporting attitude, rather than being punitive, coercive, and using violent metaphor to refer to people who may have suffered from COVID-19. So we have to model the accurate and correct behavior in order for people to pick it up from there. And finally, discrimination. So, since it's already happening, the first task you have to do is to outlaw it. Say it's not acceptable in this institution, it's not acceptable in this organization to discriminate against people on the status of their health status. So once you do that, then you find other ways of discouraging it. For instance, by making it taboo. If you are in a social group and somebody starts saying discriminatory stuff about other people, somebody else standing up to them and saying, that is not appropriate, that's not acceptable in this setting, you can't talk like that. So that helps. And as we provide care, because we have our health system here, we must uphold a rights-based approach in care and in social services. We must put the person we are taking care of at the center of our interventions, rather than putting ourselves as an organization or as an institution at the center of the intervention. Because at the end of the day, it's all about people. And it's how you treat the people that determines whether the stigma will continue or whether the stigma will go down. So certain things which are clues to an organization like AKU and to governments and to other institutions, it's very important if you're going to deal with stigma, if you're going to intervene in this setting, that you maintain the privacy and confidentiality of those seeking care and those who may be part of any contact in investigation. You can't go out there and blast out an email and say, Dean Atwoli is COVID positive, secretary is also positive. We're investigating Alex, who was sitting with him over the weekend for COVID. That's just not how it is done. That will not encourage people to come out and speak freely about it. We must quickly communicate the risk or lack of risk from contact with products, people, and places. So even if somebody is COVID positive and had some brief contact with another person, it is useful for us to communicate that, yes, you had a brief contact, 2 minutes in the same space, you all had masks, you kept 1 meter apart from each other, chances of you having been infected in that setting are close to nil. So being able to communicate this accurately and clearly and with evidence is very important in a setting like ours. Correcting negative language that can cause stigma by sharing accurate information about how the virus spreads. I think this is something we cannot do enough of. We have to constantly look out for new information about how it is spreading, how to prevent spread, and pass out this information and keep correcting the negative information. We must speak out against negative behaviors and statements, including on social media, including in official fora. We have to find ways of speaking out against those negative behaviors. We must make sure that the images we use in communications show diverse communities and do not reinforce stereotypes. So it would be a tragedy if AKU communication going out about what we are talking about, COVID-19, had only, say, Chinese faces on it. So that would be promoting stigma against those people by suggesting that these are the only people who can get this illness. And finally, when we use media channels, including news media and social media, we need to speak out against stereotyping groups of people who experience stigma because of COVID-19. A final note on stigma is what you say and do, especially in leadership, especially in positions of responsibility. It matters. We must use people-first language, and we learned this from HIV and mental health, that we don't talk about, the disease being associated to a certain group of people, to a region. We talk about people being treated for or recovering from COVID-19 rather than being cases or victims of this illness. We should avoid criminalizing language, because we talk about you are transmitting COVID-19. That is criminalizing. It's like somebody has picked it up and is running through the community giving people COVID-19, rather than talking about people who contract COVID-19 through a variety of means. We need to be factual, avoid apocalyptic language that suggests that, it's the end of the world and so on. And we must emphasize the positive. Wherever we can find it, we must emphasize the positive. One of the positives that we're emphasizing now is that we are seeing hope on the horizon. We are seeing a lot of vaccine trials coming out with very promising results, and we are very hopeful that in the next year or so, we should have something that will protect majority of the people from this disease. So that is positive messaging. It is accurate. We have the evidence, and we encourage people to continue looking at this evidence. And if there's a vaccine trial anywhere near you and you're a healthy person who is willing to participate, look for the site and get involved. And finally, we must emphasize the effectiveness of preventive measures and strategies like screening, testing, and treating this illness, because there are effective ways of handling it should it happen. So I'll spend the next few minutes just looking through, again, reprising some of the mental health consequences of COVID-19 in the context that we have spoken about, stigma. These are two of the most stigmatized things in our current existence today. And so tying them together comes naturally. It's useful for us to understand the concepts of stress. I have talked about this before, but just by way of summary, it is a tension you experience when you encounter a threat that threatens to overwhelm your coping resources. So it can be a positive thing. For instance, you have an exam and you're a bit stressed. It helps you to prepare better. But then it can also be negative if it continues for a long period of time and makes you do things that do not support you psychologically. Psychological distress is subjective. It's a sense of discomfort ranging from normal feelings of vulnerability, sadness, all sorts of fears that can become disabling to you. And this can, from anxiety all the way to severe mental illness, can cause distress, broadly imagined. And burnout affairs, to those of us who are involved in the helping professions, or those who have to give of themselves in order to support others. At the end of giving yourself over and over again, you might experience a sense of emptiness, being overwhelmed, being unable to meet your occupational, social, or other demands. And that is what we call burnout. Moral injury takes this concept a bit further for people who are working in the helping professions, but they do not feel adequately provisioned to provide the services they are able to provide. So this is a tragic thing, and we are seeing a lot of this among health workers as we speak. I know nurses and clinical officers across the country have gone on strike because of the sense that they do not have sufficient PPEs, they do not have sufficient equipment to provide the care that they're supposed to provide. So these are people who are verging on moral injury. This summarizes the risks that have to do with COVID-19 and mental health. One of the things is, because of the many unknowns, as I mentioned earlier, COVID-19 risks causing a lot of anxiety in people. So that is one of the biggest risks. The fact that it's an unseen threat, the fact that it is all over the place, it's spreading very fast. There's a lot of misinformation around it, including from what should be official sources of truth. People are spreading all sorts of information. The other day, off the cuff, the Minister for Health asked about a vaccine, says we will not allow Kenyans to be guinea pigs. There is absolutely no medical research that takes place without people volunteering to participate in studies. And then they're called guinea pigs. But you are advancing human knowledge in science, in health, by volunteering to participate in these studies. And it is a high honor for a human being to participate in something that may result in a solution to an existential threat to humanity. So such things, make things a lot more difficult for people. Some of the interventions on the right of this slide have also caused a bit of mental distress, isolation, overzealous enforcement, socioeconomic effects, job losses, and so on. These have also resulted in a lot of psychological distress and, in many cases, mental illness. Interestingly, the close interactions we have been forced to have in our families have also resulted in conflict and violence as well. And so these are some of the conditions that have been reported, the big ones: anxiety, grief, and people with pre-existing conditions like depression, anxiety disorders, psychotic illnesses have also been triggered at around this time. I have talked previously about grief, so I do not want to spend too much time on it because I would like to leave a bit more time for question and answer. But I will just mention that these are some of the disorders, psychiatric disorders, that have arisen among people with COVID-19 and those affected by COVID-19 that we are seeing currently. Anxiety disorders, substance use disorders, people with psychotic illnesses, including bipolar, mania. A lot more of those are coming up at this time. Adjustment disorder, when people have had to change their way of life, is common. Post-traumatic stress disorder and others. In children, we have seen exacerbation of these developmental disorders, ADHD, autism, and other neuropsychiatric effects due to the virus itself attacking your brain. Finally, I'll look at how do we cope? How do we deal with these situations in the context of COVID-19? For those who are in the health profession and in the helping professions, including counseling, including doctors, nurses, and so on, there are certain things that we can do as we go out and intervene. And psychological first aid is one of the simplest interventions that can be taught to anyone and that can be practiced by these frontline workers and anybody, in fact, who is experiencing issues around COVID-19, because it's about picking out what people's needs are and addressing them immediately, connecting them to sources of support, protecting them from further harm, and so on and so forth. Debriefing is very useful for health workers, especially who are working in teams. They have a meeting before they go out, they plan how they're going to deal with this, and afterwards, after intervening, after doing the care that they do at the end of the day, spending some time, a few minutes just sharing how it made them feel is helpful in building a sense of community and connectedness. Importantly, find reasons to be hopeful. Again, I don't want to spend a lot of time on this grief because we have dealt with it before, but at the end of the day, just to figure out that there are things you can do no matter where you are. When you've lost a loved one, when you've lost a colleague, when you have lost something that you value and you're going through a grieving process, there are certain things that you can do to help. And I have indicated them there depending on the stage of grief that someone is at. In general, there are certain strategies that we use to cope with stress in general. Firstly, get information from trusted sources. And there are organizations and institutions that have set themselves up at this point in time as trusted sources as far as COVID-19 is concerned. If you do not trust our own Ministry of Health, then there are academic institutions in this country which are giving out information that is accurate. There are associations like KMA and other professional associations that are giving out trusted information. There is World Health Organization and other organizations out there that you can then rely on for information. Maintain connection with social supports. This is very important. Find reasons to be happy. Take care of yourself physically, psychologically. Rest when you must. Importantly, being helpful is an important coping mechanism. So no matter where you are, no matter which sector you are in, finding ways of being helpful in this context is very important. I found children who are distributing, children who, after being cooped up in the house for long periods of time, they took clothes that they are no longer using. They found a children's home. They went to give clothes so that these children can be warm during this period. Finding something to help, however little it is an important coping mechanism for yourself. And it's important for us to be kind. There are few things that people do that we discourage. If you're going to drink or use cigarettes or other substances because you're feeling stressed, you're starting out on a slippery slope and it's going to be a lot more difficult to climb back up. If you're afraid to seek help when in need, this is going to end badly, of course. If you overindulge in food, sleep, anything you do in excess can cause problems. Importantly, and that's what I'm going to finish with, is don't overwork. You're not, because we are working digitally now, you shouldn't think that now you can do double the work that you used to do before. You just end up burning out faster, and you'll be less useful to the institution than you would have been if you paced yourself and just continue to deliver what is expected of you. So I think that, to me, is an important place to finish, and I'm happy to take questions after this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dean Atwoli. That has been quite informative and succinct. And I'll pick up from where you have ended. And I want to remind our colleagues to submit your questions to Nairobi, nbi.communications.eastafrica@aku.edu. We do have some questions that are already here, and I'd like to pick up from where Prof has ended by coming to Alex and getting a reaction. The last statement was, do not overwork. And I wonder, Alex, where what you think about that? And if indeed, you know, if we can focus on not overworking.
I think thanks Lukoya, for a very insightful presentation. I think that has become almost like an existential question, and I think mostly because, you know, we have blurred boundaries completely. Previously, there was such a place as home, and another place called work, and in between, people would get into various modes of transportation to get in between these two places. And they did one thing, just focus on what they were trying to do on the road, whether they were passengers or drivers, etc. So I think it is this erasing of those boundaries that really complicates the so-called work-life balance. In fact, that doesn't exist anymore. It is work, and then the balance part of it is being boiled out of this discussion. I think part of it is just because it's become so easy to work. We have all these gadgets. You know, you can answer emails on your phone. You can go home. You have access to Wi-Fi. You can schedule meetings after work, and all of this. I think part of it is also a reaction. It's also a coping mechanism. For some people, they tend to think that just keeping busy is important for the sake of it. There's just so much work to do. But I think we have to take care of ourselves, as Lukoya has mentioned. You've got to make sure that you take time, as some wise people say, to sharpen the soul. I think burnout, with all of the detailed explanations that Lukoya has given, is a real problem. And I think you're less useful when you cannot focus. You're less useful to the organization when you're very, very tired. You're less useful when you cannot focus on the work that you have to do. So I think, you know, as an organization, I think, and I was talking to someone today, I think we overwork ourselves. We work too hard. We make demands of our colleagues. You know, somebody sends an email at 8 p.m. in the night, and they expect that you're sitting there just waiting for the email. You know, an email comes in the middle of the night, and you're panicking if you show up in the office at 6:30 because you're late with your response. So I think, as colleagues sitting across this conversation who are supervisors, I think we have to be more humane. We've got to respect our colleagues. You know, on the weekends, don't expect people to respond to your emails. After 6, please just back off. You know, unless they're on call, we understand. But if there are colleagues who are not on call, who are not attending to emergencies, I think we should leave them alone. And let's try and reinstate that healthy balance between work and the home place.
Wow, thank you, Alex. I love that response, because it segues nicely to my next question, because your answers are really modeling great leadership behaviors. But in the conversation that we are having. What do you think that perhaps in terms of supporting colleagues, and especially particularly thinking around the conversations we should be having with re-entry of colleagues who've had COVID-19 and have recovered and are back to work, what do we need to be thinking about, especially for colleagues who are responsible for teams, but also for us, when our colleagues come back, what kind of behaviors we need to be modeling, what kind of conversations do we need to be having?
I think we have to be humble enough to accept that we don't know enough about how to deal with this period. And supervisors and colleagues need to seek the help they need. I think I really like the opening frames around stigma, the ignorance, the prejudice, and the discrimination. I think for the most part, even as senior colleagues, as supervisors of other colleagues, we are ignorant, and most of the time we're also prejudiced. This othering, this kind of distancing of ourselves from the predicament of other colleagues, it doesn't help for creating a conducive, supportive environment. And I think, honestly, because we're talking as colleagues in one organization, I have been extremely disconcerted about some of the communications that I have seen. Exactly what Lukoy described, where one individual was named very explicitly, and the individuals that he had been in contact with, they were contacted by email. Can you imagine you're at home, just trying to settle down from a hard day's job, and an email pops up on your phone or a text message, and it tells you that Alex Awiti was sitting next to you today and he's tested positive. And you start looking at everybody around the house and you're going, holy moly, did I just try to kill my entire family? And then I think that just sets the path of the prejudice that is predicated on ignorance and just not helpful, tactful, thoughtful conversation and sensitivity with which we should handle colleagues. And I think colleagues coming back from this situation are already traumatized just by the experience of the disease. And then coming back to all these knowing looks from colleagues across the table who now look at you as some kind of a person who is just emitting plague. And I think it makes it really, really hard. So I think this is an important conversation led by HR to basically figure out the next step is really speak to supervisors about the sensitivity of communicating very sensitive private information about individuals. And this kind of naming and shaming, which seems to be the path that we've taken, in just being very publicly explicit about individuals. I understand contact tracing, but where is the tact? Where is the confidentiality around handling these kinds of issues? And when people come back to work, it's like everybody knows you had COVID. That makes it really, really difficult to re-enter the workplace. And I don't know how many ways we can say that this is not okay. We should make sure that people have the decency and the privacy that they need to go through something that is privately extremely difficult.
Thank you, Alex. And you've touched on quite some pertinent issues that we will take up going forward. I'd like to bring Amina into this conversation. And Amina, COVID-19 is obviously something that has impacted us from a health perspective, but I know you're doing some interesting studies around issues of mental health as well. And perhaps you might want to discuss with us some of the other social effects that we could be experiencing, perhaps our colleagues are experiencing, and are wondering, how do I even, deal with this?
Thank you, Terry. I think first, just a big thanks to Dean Lukoy. I think it was a really insightful discussion. I think just picking from his comments, one thing that comes out clearly, we need information and we need to be careful of how we put it out there, ensuring we are not using language that makes those who already have contracted this disease may have a certain level of, what is this called, guilt. So I think really that is the message I take from that presentation. We need to talk more about COVID, but check our language, ensure it is not in any way sending out a sense of guilt to others. Going back to the issues about COVID and its impact, I think we did a study, although it was largely in the urban informal settlements, so working with very vulnerable populations, I think and pregnant mothers and families of people with disability. But I think these are things we can all relate with. Some of the impacts, of course, are economic impacts, I think almost everyone has been touched, whether you are employed, or you are in business, those the economic impact. But I think the other one that came out really strongly was the change in routine. As adults, we've come to have a certain routine where we expected children to go to school early in the morning. We turned up to the place of work. There was a lot of social contact at the place of work, So that change of routine was found to be extremely stressful. As Professor Tolly has said, we even found that there was quite an increase in gender-based violence. But for people at home, parents now became also teachers, Now their children, I know that we were told by the minister that, you have to take care of your child, but you also have a day job. You've also moved your work to your office to their house. So really getting that balance right. Now children see mommy at home, they want to play with mommy, but mommy has to also sit into this meeting and has to continue responding. So that was some of the really major impacts. But I think also just psychologically, the uncertainty of what next. Even at this point, we don't know what 2021 will look like. We don't know if the second wave has gone or another wave will come back. So that uncertainty has caused quite a bit of issues in terms of planning and how people look at the future. So that managing what will happen next and becomes one of the key challenges that families have had to experience.
Well, thank you. And you've talked about schools because that's an area that I think most of our colleagues are particularly interested in because a lot of us are parents. And what would you say, perhaps, are some of the things that colleagues can do to help navigate these issues of our children schooling in January with the COVID and all this, or indeed the lack of the schooling that we've experienced in 2020?
I think for me, as a developmental psychologist, what comes to mind, the first thing is that these 9 months have really increased the social inequalities. So there are some kids who have access to all these gadgets and they're able to continue with some level of learning, but there are some kids who have not had they've had very little in terms of learning. But also when you think of schooling, we need to look at it as a social experience. It's not just that kids turn up in class, it's the way they go and interact with the peers, the skills they've learned. So I think it's a challenge that one has to put in context. One thing to look at it is this is an opportunity for the family to do more in terms of the time they spend with the children, but also not an opportunity to add extra pressure on yourself. The problem is then you try to be the teacher, the parent, and everything. I would say, let's take life as it comes, keep our children engaged, ensure they're meaningfully engaged in different things without adding pressure to them or to ourselves as parents.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Amina. I want to come back to Professor Lukoe. And there's a question that has come, which is quite intriguing. Somebody wants to know, what do you think about the COVID-19 preventative measures like social distancing and quarantining? Are these not encouraging the stigma?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think when something threatens life, you take immediate measures to protect life first. And then after you've protected life and lives are safe, then you start looking at other considerations, including function and including aesthetics and how things look like. So when COVID-19 landed, our first priority was to ensure that as many people as possible remain healthy while other solutions are found. And since it is a respiratory virus that is transmitted through droplet and stuff coming out of our lungs mostly. So the preventative measures were aimed at ensuring that there's as little risk as possible to other people if somebody happened to be infected. And so wearing a mask became very important, especially when there are people in gatherings. Wearing a mask reduces, if everybody wears a mask, it reduces the risk significantly. Then another layer of protection is keeping people far apart, so that in the unlikely event that some droplets escaped, behind your mask or anything, then it wouldn't be able to travel far enough to get onto someone else and therefore cause infection. The other measures, including cleaning of surfaces and so on, are predicated on the fact that these droplets, when they land on a surface, the virus continues to survive for a period of time. And if somebody touches it and touches their faces, then they have a risk of getting infected. The same way we tell people don't touch your face unnecessarily, and especially with hands that you have not sanitized or cleaned, again, to reduce that virus from getting into you. Today, we can tell you without an iota of doubt that these measures have been demonstrated to be extremely successful in reducing the risk of infection. They have looked at cities where none of those measures were being taken and people were having parties and so on. And then those measures were introduced, and they have tracked the infection rates of this virus. And interestingly, the infection rates trend downwards when those measures are taken, and they start trending upwards when those measures are relaxed. And Kenya is an example. We have had what might look like several waves of this pandemic, and each wave is often preceded by a relaxation of these public health measures. So from where I sit, the measures were appropriate, and they have been demonstrated to work. The only problem is if you are implementing them without due regard to other social realities, including people's ability to acquire those masks, people's ability to maintain physical distancing, people's ability to do all the things that we ask them to keep their hands clean. They have water, they have sanitizer, and so on. So as a government or an implementing agency, we tell you that this is what you require to do in order to reduce the risk of infection. And then you use the resources available to you to implement that. So in the case of Kenya and many other countries, there might have been other considerations other than the effectiveness of these measures, including our ability to actually implement them to the letter.
Thank you. Let me tie that into something else that you've been working on, Prof., which is a lot of studies in matters, suicide, etc. And I know that area has had some significant impact on a lot of perhaps people in our communities who have been touched one way or another. And I wonder how this ties in, particularly for the youth and those who are feeling perhaps that these restrictions are not positive experience for them.
So studies after study have shown that both COVID-19 and the restrictions that have been placed in order to prevent its spread or reduce its spread have had mental health effects across board. And among young people, there have been serious, significant impacts because young people are active by nature. Young people want to be out there doing something useful for themselves or educating themselves and so on, or socializing with their peers. And this has been curtailed and this has affected them significantly. Young people are reporting increased levels of stress. They're reporting increased levels of anxiety. There are higher rates of depression now compared to a comparable period in the past. Suicide statistics are poorly kept, and we haven't seen an uptick yet in the data itself. But of course, there are many, many reports of young people who have taken their lives as a result of the circumstances they find themselves in around this COVID-19. We have set up a suicide prevention working group, technical working group with the Ministry of Health, and I'm privileged to sit on it. And we're developing a strategy that will include surveillance, continuous surveillance of suicide statistics, as well as periodic surveys to determine what's happening in the community. And this will start giving us an idea about trends within or outside of occurrences like this pandemic. But indeed, the mental health impacts, we are seeing them in the community, and we are afraid that the suicide rates, because suicide usually trails mental ill health, and it's often a final common pathway. So we are afraid that if we do not do sufficient work at this time, we might start seeing an uptick in the rates of suicide beginning next year. And we are working hard to try and prevent that.
Now, I pick up from that. Thank you very much, Prof. Alex. You've done a lot of work in the area of youth. And if I take what Prof is saying to the next level. I wonder, and especially because most of our colleagues are really in the bracket of youth, and whilst we are being told by the experts that, you know, the youth are largely asymptomatic, etc., what are the things that we need to pay attention to, even though those that are in that bracket are not experiencing severe disease? What are the things we need to pay attention to when we're managing our young adults who are our children at home or our brothers and sisters?
So that's a kind of the $60 million question. I think it boils down to personal responsibility and a very unambiguous understanding that we're all connected, in the sense that even though young people, anybody below the age of 35, for the most part, who has no comorbidities, could contract COVID, but will not develop severe illness or even mild illness. For the most part, they might be asymptomatic, but it doesn't mean that they're not spreading COVID, that people who come into contact with them, if they're not social distancing, if they're not wearing masks, if they're not sanitizing, they could infect other people. And I think one of the other kind of realities of our lives is that we live in intergenerational families. You will, as a young person, be living with somebody who's older than you, who might be your dad or your mom, or you might travel a country or even in the city and visit your grandparents and put them at risk. So that's the part that we have to really think about. It's not really about you. If you're not in that bracket that is vulnerable to contracting COVID and then getting severe illness. But I think what we need to pay attention to is you will put at risk other people's lives. And you don't want to be in a position where you now regret your actions or your omissions. So I think what we need to really think about is how do we act, all of us together, to basically break the circuit. That means that don't be the person who is asymptomatic and then transmits the disease to somebody else because you love them and because you just didn't care to think that you may have been exposed yourself, you don't even know about it, but you're basically transmitting the disease. I think this is the evil genius of this virus. Many diseases you can only transmit once you're ill. You're really, really sick. But this one is a disease that you transmit. You're infectious when you're asymptomatic, and nobody knows. Even you don't know. So I wouldn't blame young people who go on to make their parents, uncles, and all the members of their family sick and severely so, because they didn't know that they were sick. But I think for us here as AKU, we have the CHET screening application that I think is broadly diagnostic of the symptoms of the disease. They're not kind of ironclad, absolutely reliable, but they give you a very good sense of how you're feeling that day. So if you're very honest with yourself and you really listen to your body, which all of us must, then you'll be in a very, very good position to prevent transmitting the illness to somebody else. So I think it's just about solidarity. How can we all act together to support all of us to basically break the spread of COVID?
Thank you, Alex. Now, as we are winding down, I have just a few more questions that the audience would like to hear from our panelists about. The first one, Alex, this is to you. The institution, of course, has offered us a lot of support in many valuable ways during this season of COVID, and especially the support in terms of should we get unwell, etc. And would there perhaps be ways to explore how we could expand that conversation to cover other members who are close to us, loved ones, perhaps on various models? Is there something that perhaps we should be discussing?
I think this is an important question because in the last town hall, for those of you who were participating in this webinar, this question was raised and Al Karim, I think, took the question and basically said it is something that we should actively explore. I think, as Amina indicated in her remarks, there has been widespread turmoil that arises from the disease, not just directly from economic income, but also just the sickness and the illness and mobility of your relatives, of your loved ones, who are not part of your nuclear family, then not covered in the AKD, in the AKU health scheme. But there's even a broader conversation at the AKDN level, talking about AKDN discounts, talking about Jubilee insurance and all of these things. So I think we need to explore a much wider conversation. And Al Karim mentioned in his remarks that these are open for consideration. We just have to look at the cost. So if there is some subsidy and a copay, then I think those should be conversations that we open. If I brought in my parents into the scheme, what would be the copay on my part for them at a subsidized rate that would afford them some level of service? Because honestly, in our cultural existence, if my parent is sick or if my uncle is sick, you don't expect me to be working really hard every day, because eventually I have to be sitting somewhere trying to raise resources to support their medical care somewhere. So if we can create that pool that then supports us through the very robust AKDN network to afford care in an extended fashion beyond AKU employees, I think that's a discussion that we should actively explore.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Alex. Now, we are really, really pressed for time. So I'm going to do one last question for each panelist. And this question is a question that, believe you me, has a lot of interest from people who've sent in questions asking about the same thing. What do you do at a personal level? How have you coped with the challenges of mental wellness during COVID? Now, some of you I know, because on social media, they are very loud about their love for Sauti Sol. So, Lukoy, you have to tell us something else other than Sauti Sol, and perhaps you can be the first one off the mark with this one.
Yeah, I listen to music. I listen to music quite a lot, and I enjoy Sauti Sol, as you've said, and I enjoy a lot of other music as well, along the same genre. But I read, I spend time with my family. So I've been asked many times, sometimes by media and so on, if I can spare a couple of hours to go and do a media appearance on Sunday. And I've said I'm not able because that's the day I'm hanging out with my family and I'm not going to compromise on that. So it's important to have a certain set of things that you do that ensure that you remain grounded, even though these things are happening around you. For me, the final thing that I would say is very important for me is the fact that I have remained active in the interventions right from the beginning. So involving myself in the thick of things, trying to figure out solutions, designing programs that help people has been one other way that I have used to cope during this period of COVID-19.
Wow.
Yeah.
Thank you. Amina?
Okay, so I would say two things. One is finding a way to be useful. How can I contribute in the community has been very important for me. But the other thing has been around the issue of it is really physical distancing and not social distancing. Keeping in touch with people, being connected with friends, colleagues, family has been very important.
Wow. Alex?
Well, I'm trying to find stuff for me to do. So I think right about the time when the lockdown started, I started keeping chickens. So now over the weekend, I'm feeding chickens and doing all kinds of things. So I think I've found some other passion outside the work that I do at AKU. But I think part of the other thing is also just to constantly engage in learning. And I think through some of the writing that I do, that's how I learn, and that's how I basically try to make sense of the world around me. But I think in many ways, as Amina said, how do you stay connected with friends and family? How do you make sure that you're not socially distanced, but maintaining those bonds of affection throughout this time? So I think it and of course, just exercising, walking around, be active. Don't just sit around on the weekend. And as Lukoy said, don't start getting into bad habits like drinking, eating, or sleeping too much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing that. I would like now to bring this to a close. First off, by thanking each and every one of you who's connected remotely, who's not able to be in this room with us, because this is the times, the seasons that we are living in. But we do know for sure that this will change in time. But we are all the same very grateful that you took time to sit wherever you are, or walk, or whatever it is you're doing, and listen in, because these are really important conversations that we intend to keep having. And then I want in a special way to thank colleagues who have supported us as we are trying to get this off the ground. And we know we will continue to need a lot of your support. And finally, but really, really, truly, in a big way, thank our colleagues, Alex, Lukoy, and Amina, for joining us to share what it is that you have shared with our AKU community, and for us to constantly have top of mind that we need to do a lot of self-care, and whether it's going to be the music as Atoli does, or it's going to be the getting involved with the work that's there, like Amina does, or indeed if it's going to be keeping chickens like Alex does. So we're going to be asking him about whether we can order eggs and meat soon, that we will have to do everything we can to remain socially connected, even though we're socially distanced. Thank you very much. Have a really good evening and all the very best. See you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay.